You dropped the bomb on me. But you turned me on. You dropped the bomb on me.
North Korean state news agencies are saying that this was a successful test of a missile, a medium to long range, ground-to-ground missile fired early Sunday in North Korea, and they are putting that provocative threat to the United States, saying, quote, that they're claiming that the U.S. mainland and Pacific operation are within North Korean sighting strike range.
Another weekend, another missile test by the Cabbage Patch Doll president of North Korea. During the campaign, I had a kind of a crazy suggestion. A lot of people thought I was crazy. I think I might have even shared it with candidate Trump, that he should travel as a candidate to the DMZ and travel to South Korea, stand with our South Korean allies, because the North Korea situation was the most immediate threat to the United States. And we had person after person come on the show as I recommended this, and of course they didn't do it. He didn't end up taking a foreign trip when he was candidate. I just thought that would have really sent a message saying, look, we're on to you. We know what you're doing, and when I'm president, it's going to be a new approach. He didn't, but that threat really is here in all of its fullness now. Joining us now is one of the foremost experts in the Korea problem, which has been a problem and recognized in the Korean War by General MacArthur as something that would continue to be really important for America to stay on top of. MacArthur looks more and more brilliant with each passing year. Victor Davis Hanson, writer, American military historian, columnist, joins us now. VDH, good to have you with us. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
So MacArthur turns out to be genius every other day. I mean, I think of him and what he said about Korea in the aftermath of the armistice, and here we are, all these years later, with Korea the biggest threat facing the United States.
Yeah, I think that was MacArthur had been beaten in 50, as you know, by December. The Chinese invaded with almost 1 million people and pushed us back, and then he was relieved in April. But Matthew Ridgway had got us back to the 38th parallel. Brilliant campaign in 51 by March. And then the question was, well, we've beaten the Chinese, we've beaten the North Koreans. Now we can go back up the way MacArthur did with too few troops. And MacArthur supported Ridgway. And then the Truman administration said, you know what, let's just sit here and negotiate. And then for the next 2 years, that was the Korean War. We sat on the 38th parallel, even though we had pretty much defeated both North Korea and China. China lost 1 million people in the Korean War because they were absolutely devastated in early 1951 by air and artillery strike. So that was the first time in the history of the United States we decided that in the so-called nuclear age we would have a negotiated armistice rather than a victory. And I think you're right, we paid for it. But I don't know, if we hadn't saved South Korea, there wouldn't be a Samsung or a Kia today with all look like North Korea. But that set up an example that we were not able to translate battlefield victories into strategic resolutions in our favor.
Yeah, think about the world, just so we set the stage here for understanding the Korea threat today. Victor, take us back to 1945. World War II is ending. You know, Mao is not at all in power, and we're still more or less supporting, at the time, nationalist China and Chiang Kai-shek. And then Stalin, correct me if I'm wrong, but Stalin, the Soviets played no role in the struggle against the Japanese Empire. Then take it from there. So just, again, setting the stage for how this all developed.
Well, I think we thought that because we had such overwhelming economic and industrial power, and the Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. China was a wasteland that had lost 15 million people. There was no Japan. Japan was ruined. Germany was ruined. Italy was ruined. Great Britain was bankrupt. The United States decided, this is the time where we're going to be magnanimous, and we're going to deal with Uncle Joe, and we're not going to press him too on Eastern Europe. He broke all of his agreements in places like Austria, but especially Poland and Romania and all that. So we're going to set up a United Nations, and they really did believe the Roosevelt administration, and for a couple of years, the Truman administration, that that we were going to have sort of the end of war, the end of conflict, and the utopian age. And then by the time we woke up, the Soviet Union's vast industrial economy that was 90% geared to war in 44 and 45, 20% of it fueled by Lend-Lease, was flooding the world with cheap weapons. They had the bomb, and they were supplying Mao, who took over a billion-person China, and then all of Southeast Asia. And then we were stuck with this sort of bad propaganda. We're gonna turn fascists like the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese into Democrats, and they're going to be good people, but we're going to have to work with them. And whereas the Russians were saying, "Oh, you guys are supporting fascists, we're supporting the aims of World War II by liberating people," and we weren't able to win the propaganda war by saying, "No, you guys had killed 20 million people before the war even started. Mao's killing millions right now, and they're going to kill more." We lost that propaganda war.
Right, and think about Stalin. Stalin hadn't even declared war on Japan until, what was it, a few weeks?
The biggest mistake we made is, if you go back to the Yalta Agreement, we didn't really know whether it was in February, we didn't really know where the atomic bomb was going to work in June. We were worried about after Okinawa, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, we felt, wow, if we invade Japan, we're going to have 1 million people. The Soviet Union's almost won. Let's cut a deal and say that we'll invite him in to Japan. And he was really a two-timing SOB because he had a non-aggression pact with Japan where Americans were supplying the Soviets from Portland and Seattle right to Vladivostok, right through Japanese waters, and they had an agreement with the Japanese. So he was almost pro-Japanese and really hurt us. And then he looked at Korea, and he looked at Manchuria, and he looked at China, and he said, "Okay, I'll help you guys." And we signed on to it, and then we dropped the bomb in July, and it worked. And then we thought, wow, we really didn't need him. But once we made the deal, he got a toehold in China and Southeast Asia and Korea, and we paid the price ever since.
Yeah, well, is it too harsh to say then? And again, we set this historical narrative up for our listeners, so you understand the importance of the Korean Peninsula and how we got here, so that this country was partitioned. And is it too out there to say then that Truman actually, kind of established Kim Il-sung, and he kind of paved the way for North Korea? Is that?
Well, he did one good thing, and that is in June when North Korea invaded, we had almost no troops there. He had done a bad thing by drawing them all out and dismantling the military. And everybody Dean Acheson had said that's none of our problem. It's not in our defensive sphere. They invaded. They got all the way down to Pusan. What was left of Korea by July was 50 miles. That was all it was, north and south. And then Truman made a decision, very unpopular with his left wing, to try to save Korea. And then he did. He saved the South. And then MacArthur said after Incheon, "I can save the whole thing and honor the agreements we made at Potsdam." And he did. He only got to the Yellow River, and then it got cold, and a million people invaded, and then he was pushed back 500 miles, and then Ridgway came in and saved it again. And then, as I said, we were in a position where we could have taken the entire peninsula probably. But Truman said, "You know what? I'm not going to do this again. I'm tired of this, what they called an accordion war, from Seoul to Pyongyang, back to Seoul, back to Pyongyang." And that's what happened.
You last year.
Truman.
Oh. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, last year you described Korea, and this is pretty much how MacArthur described it. If we didn't resolve Korea, it was going to be a problem for the next 50 years. No truer words have ever been said. But you described it as being an incomplete victory. It's always called the forgotten war, but you said it's an incomplete victory. So what if things worked out unthinkably well for Korea and the United States? So a free and prosperous, unified Korea, what would that have meant to the survival of communist China?
Well, I think if we'd had a free Korea, something like Japan or Taiwan or Australia, even the Philippines, we probably wouldn't have had a Vietnam or Thailand or Laos go communist, and we would have had enormous pressure on China on all sides. And we probably would have been able to contain the Chinese revolutionary meddling all over from Africa to Asia. So it would have been very important. And even sadder, though, is that model of Korea was seen as a success. So when we went into Vietnam, we said, well, we're going to do what we did in Korea. We're going to just take the South and save it, when the real only way to win Vietnam was to defeat the communists in the North. And we almost did under Nixon. In fact, we did, basically. And then we sort of had a peace treaty in 73 that said, okay, 50-50, then the Democratic Senate gave it up. But Korea had a really baleful influence because it said, this is a model that's successful, and you win half, and that's a victory. And ever since Iraq or Afghanistan or you name it, any major war we've had, the goal is not to defeat, humiliate the enemy. It's to sort of hit him a couple of times and say, please get away from us.
We're talking to Victor Davis Hanson here on the Laura Ingraham Show, writer, author, military historian. So, again, setting this all up. So would you – I'm going to ask this the right way. But so would you agree, Victor, that from Roosevelt – Bernard Baruch, right up to Dean Acheson, Truman, all the way up to today, that Korea is the pivot for globalist developments in the region and in the world. You really can take it all back to Korea, to the incomplete victory in the Korean War, and all these things that followed as a result.
Yeah, I think so, with one caveat, and that was, to be fair to them, they said, and they simplified it, that the presence of nuclear weapons and the acquisition of them by the Soviet Union in 49 and then the hydrogen bomb in 53 meant that the old rules didn't apply. And, of course, the old rules always apply. They're just more dangerous. So they said, and it's a nuclear war now. There's no such thing as victory or defeat. They're just negotiated settlements because some country will use nuclear weapons. But the problem that they set up is we were always threatened by the communist bloc using that nuclear weapons, and we had to accept that caveat. And so we didn't build an adequate missile defense system. We didn't. We say that John Foster Dulles engaged in brinksmanship. We didn't do that very much. So we accepted the rules of nuclear deterrence and strategy on the communist side, on their view, and Korea was a casualty of that. And 26 million people eat grass some days when they're starving to death in Korea, so it was a humanitarian issue as well. I think for a brief moment, Matthew Ridgway had support, and MacArthur had been able to get along with Truman, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. In March of 1951, we had the ability to go all the way to the Yalta River and then win the war as we tried the year earlier.
No, and now fast forward to
tragedy.
Yeah, it is. It makes you now. And people, you don't hear this radio. You don't hear this conversation on radio today because the only thing people cover is Trump said this about North Korea. But people have to understand how we got into this mess, because conservatives actually believe you can learn from history. You don't have to repeat the mistakes of history. You can learn and you have to adapt, but you can actually learn about what an incomplete victory can do to a dynamic moving forward a half a century later to where we are today, where China wants to dominate the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula. They had a big conference last week, the Silk and the Road, or whatever it's called, the Silk and the Way conference. We had people from all over the world coming to bid on a $500 billion infrastructure project that they have in China. Because why? They have massive trade surpluses and a lot of money to build out their infrastructure, and that's where China is today.
I'd say, just in ending, that there was a first Punic War, there was a second Punic War, there was a third, and finally the Romans learned that there wasn't going to be a fourth. And so same thing in the Civil War, same thing with World War II. We never really finished World War I. We had an armistice. We didn't defeat Germany inside Germany. But, boy, you read what our planners said in World War II. They said, we're not going to do what we did in World War I. We're not going to allow Germany to surrender overseas and claim that they were really the winners of 2 or 3 years later. So we had no Versailles Treaty in World War II, believe me. Mm-hmm. It was very punitive. We occupied them, we humiliated them. We said, the war is all yours. We had no magnanimity as we did in Versailles, which was caricatured as too tough. In fact, Versailles was too soft because we never occupied Germany, and we never really tried to rebuild it because we never put American troops there, and we never really defeated the German army. It surrendered while it was in somebody else's country. And so I think that lesson of World War II was what we should have really kept. But instead we kind of went back to an earlier idea of World War I. Well, let's have an armistice. An armistice is always, as General Folk said, it's always a prescription for another war in about 20 years.
Don't resolve it. You don't resolve it. We saw that with Saddam. Different kind of situation in the Middle East, because you could argue that Saddam in power would have been better than Saddam not in power today, but that's for another conversation. Author of Carnage and Culture, Hoover Institution, phenomenal columnist, National Review Institute fellow, Victor Davis Hanson. Thank you so much for this conversation. Really, it's great. I could talk to him all day. Stay with us. Don't go away.
The Laura Ingraham Show.